Okay, the next concept is virtualization, and virtualization is really a big jump forward kind of in the last 10 years or so. We've been able to virtualize pretty much everything. Started off with virtualizing workstations, it's moved on to servers and storage and then networking. So all of the main areas within a typical IT department with a typical IT infrastructure have now been able to be virtualized, and there's a number of kind of major players in that space that you should just be aware of. I'm not endorsing one over the other, of course, but VMware, Microsoft Hyper-V, KVM, and Oracle all have their own virtualization platforms. And what virtualization really does, it takes the capabilities and the personality of a physical device and it converts it to a virtual representation. Basically meaning we can take a PC or a server, all the physical attributes, all the things that you typically associate with that server, the amount of CPU capability, the processor, the network, the amount of RAM, so on and so forth. We can virtualize that and basically place it into a container, if you will, onto another server. So in other words, we could take 5, 10, 15, 20 physical servers, virtualize those, and put those virtual representations or those virtual containers onto a single server. In this instance, let's just say like a VMware ESX host or ESX cluster. So we could take a number of servers, put them onto one physical box. All right, so that's going to basically allow us to perform the same functions as the physical counterpart. It will lower our infrastructure costs because instead of having to buy 20 or 30 servers now, we can simply buy 20 or 30 licenses and put them on a single physical server or a cluster. All right, so we're going to lower infrastructure costs. However, you'll notice that we're going to increase licensing costs, the hypervisor license for those individual VMs. So here you see in a traditional server, we have the server at the bottom. We install an operating system on top of that server, and then we install our applications on top of the operating system. Okay, that's just a typical server rollout or a typical workstation. In a VMware or a virtualized environment, okay, it works basically the same amongst all of the virtualization platforms. We have our server or our cluster of servers. We're going to lay the hypervisor on top. In this case, in this example, it's VMware. And then on top of that, we're going to lay down individual VMs. And each of these guests are comprised of an OS and an app or multiple apps. So we're in essence taking what used to be a physical server, virtualizing that into a single container and dropping that on top of our hypervisor. So in this VMware example, we have an ESX cluster. Okay, you'll notice 4 servers in our cluster. We have our VMware OS on top of that. All right, it's a virtual symmetric multiprocessing operating system. You'll notice that we have, in this example, 4 VMs sitting on top of that. We have one with 4 cores, one with 1, 2, and then 1. So each one of our VMs are individual. Okay, they're distinct entities, just as if they were physical servers, and they can have their own number of processors, their own amount of memory, own amount of storage, so on and so forth. And we can dynamically dial that up or down. So if we find that we have a VM that's not really performing as well as it should, we can actually add more processors or more processing power or more memory to that VM dynamically. All right. In some instances, depending upon the software, it might require a reboot. But regardless, we can add resources to that rather than having to go out and buy a new physical server. On the ESX cluster itself, or the ESX host, basically we have a pooled or a set of pooled resources. So CPU, memory, storage, and network, all of that is shared among all of the VMs sitting on that ESX cluster. So now instead of having a physical server for every application, let's say we have 5 databases, instead of having 5 physical servers like we would do in a traditional environment, we can have one ESX cluster and then 5 VMs. That way each of the VMs are much more fully utilized, and the actual ESX cluster, the physical hardware, is much better utilized. All right, we also reduce power, cooling, heating and cooling, so on and so forth. Now here's an example of VMware vCenter. Okay, the main screen. It shows our entire infrastructure as far as all the VMs, all the vCenters in our environment, and then the individual components that make up our different clusters, and then it shows the health, any risks that may pop up, our overall efficiency, and then it shows the workloads, CPU, memory, disk, and network for the entire cluster, any anomalies, faults, so on and so forth. So it allows us to look at a glance and see how our entire VMware infrastructure is doing. And we can also look at an individual guest. Okay, so we can highlight a server inside of there and say, okay, how is that individual VM operating, or how is it functioning? We can look at the workload, the CPU, memory, disk, and network for that individual guest, get our overall health, CPU, memory utilization, down to the to the point in time that we want to look at, or we can go back historically and say, well, this has been running kind of hot, say 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. each morning. We can go back and say, okay, what's going on at that point in time? It allows us to get a historical analysis of what's going on in our environment.